So we've been talking about some ordinary people for the last few weeks because I don't know about you, but when you read the Bible and you hear Bible stories and preachers preach about different people in the Bible, doesn't it seem like some of them are just almost supernatural? Like I could never be a David who goes out with a slingshot and kills a giant. I could never be like a Daniel in the lion's den who survives the night with all these lions. I could never be like these three guys that we've heard about in church through the years, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that step into this fiery furnace and God shows up in the scene and they come out not being burned. I mean, there's miracle story after miracle story in there. And sometimes when you read the Bible, it would just be great if there would be some ordinary people in the Bible. But there are some ordinary people in the Bible. And so we started talking about a woman a couple of weeks ago. We talked about this woman who learned the value of releasing and giving something up to God. And in return, God gave back to her more than she could have ever imagined. And then the next week, we talked about an ordinary, these are unnamed people. Then we talked about overcoming the sense of fear and just doing something that we can all get so comfortable in our faith and do nothing throughout our lifetime. When we serve God, we love God, but we do nothing for God. And so he said, sometimes we just need to overcome fear and overcome comfort and do something for God. And I love the stories that I've heard just since a couple of weeks ago. I mean, we've got a board member over here. Sean just did something. He brought a goat to church, and we sold more than 40 goats when we were looking for 25 goats, right? Somebody else came to me and said, Pastor, here's my doing something. And they visited somebody in the hospital and brought them a gift, not knowing how powerful and valuable their presence was going to be. They just said, this is what I can do. And that's what they did. Somebody else, as a response to that message, said, Pastor, I've always had it in my heart to start an exercise class. I think I want to do that. So we're going to start an exercise class at Life Church. Isn't that great? I'm already in an exercise class. Here's how it works. Sit down, stand up. There, we're done. It's good, right? Those are called sit-ups. We just sit up, And so anyway, but it's just doing something. But I think as I pondered this and I put this series together, I thought, I bet there's a lot of people that are willing to do something. They want to do something. We would like to be known for something. We want to do something great, something powerful, something amazing. We'd love to do it, but I'm just guessing that maybe you, maybe like me, sometimes you're kind of anchored and dogged down by something we call shame. Shame is really an interesting concept. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt and shame are really close cousins. But guilt is the regret of an action. I've done something wrong and I feel bad about it, but shame goes deeper than that. Shame is a regret about who I am. Guilt says, I've done something wrong. Shame says, you are something wrong. And so then we come to church on a Sunday morning or we hear Bible stories preached and we kind of relive whatever it is in our life that makes us feel this shame. And the shame creates this sense of comparing ourselves with other people in the church. We don't know everybody's story in here. We think we do. We see them in church. We see the way they dress, the way they conduct themselves, and we could never be like them. And yeah, look at them, and look at they're up here singing, and look at their passing out bulletins. Look at them. But I could never do that because if people really knew my story. And shame is this shadow that just follows us sometimes from our childhood. Maybe you, like me, can remember somebody, maybe they had a finger in your face. And you can remember the look on their face. You can remember the tone of their voice. You can remember the atmosphere of the room. When they looked at you in the eye, and they said, shame on you. And you've relived that over and over in your mind so many times that you've begun to believe it. And shame kind of manifests itself in so many different ways in our lives. It makes us feel insecure and uncertain and not sure if we should try something. Sometimes it's our shyness, it's our poor self-esteem. It's birthed out of the pages of our past. Maybe because we were abused or neglected or abandoned or maybe criticized somewhere along the line. And maybe you were touched emotionally. Maybe you were touched physically in places that nobody should ever be touched in ways no one should ever touch you. And what resulted was shame. And it's just always kind of there. And when the circumstances are just right, you can learn how to kind of bury it and deal with it and ignore it. But when the circumstances are just right, or you get into this place, or you get into the church, you can hear it again. Shame on you. And if anybody really knew what happened, or they really knew your story, and I think we walk around with a sense of this sometimes, and we want to do something great, but I can't because there's something in my past. And so how do we get beyond that? Let me share with you a story, and I love this story. You've heard this story. You know this story perhaps. Luke, one of the Bible writers, I'm going to read what Luke said about it in Luke chapter 8. In Luke chapter 8, he tells this amazing story about an unnamed woman, an ordinary person. She wasn't a superhero. She didn't have superpowers. She wasn't empowered by the power of God in some supernatural circumstance where she needed to kill a giant or defeat lions. She's just an ordinary woman, but she did something because she felt, I think, the sense of shame. Let me just take you to the setting for a moment. Jesus is doing his public ministry. He's out amongst the crowds. As I've said before, Jesus is like a rock star. Wherever Jesus goes, people want to go because miracles happen. There was hope in the presence of Jesus. Jesus spoke liberating truth. People love the optimism and the passion of Jesus. So wherever he goes in the public, he's always surrounded by a crowd. And Luke starts the story by telling the backstory. He kind of starts at the end of the story, at the beginning of the story, when he talks about this woman. And when we read the Bible, we read it naturally with our Western eyes. We don't understand fully the Jewish culture, but when you understand the Jewish culture, this story takes on a whole different meaning. And so Luke starts talking about this whole situation when he says, there was a guy, Jesus is walking through the crowds, and this guy just kind of breaks through the crowds. His name was Jairus. Jairus had a 12-year-old girl who's dying. She's laying on her deathbed, and he approaches Jesus and saying, Jesus, you got to come to my house, lay your hands on my daughter. She's sick and dying, and I need you there. And as Jesus maybe turns and begins in that direction towards the house of Jairus, Luke says something else happened. And chapter 8, beginning in verse 43, that there was a woman in that crowd that I just told you about, and she had suffered. Isn't it interesting that the little girl that needs healing is 12 years old? And for 12 years, this woman in the crowd has had a constant bleeding, and she couldn't find a cure. Looked pretty hopeless. Now let me take you into the Jewish culture to fully understand this whole thing. If you know any Orthodox Jews, in the strictest sense, even in our culture today, you've heard of things called kosher foods, foods that are permissible to eat. And was it prepared in a kosher way? Because they want to adhere to the strict dietary laws. Here's a Jewish woman in a crowd of Jewish people with the Jewish rabbi, Jesus. And she, for 12 years, has had an issue of blood. And to us, that doesn't mean the same thing as it would to the Jewish person, because in the Old Testament, you can read about this in Leviticus chapter 15, that whenever a woman had an issue of blood, it made her ceremonially unclean. It was a big deal. For once every month, when a woman came of age, for once a month, a woman was essentially quarantined to her house. Because in the Old Testament Jewish law, anything she touched became unclean. Any chair that she sat upon became ceremonially unclean. Any bed upon which she would sleep would become ceremonially unclean. Any person that she would touch would become ceremonially unclean. And if you knew that you were ceremonially unclean, that meant you had to take off your garments, you had to wash them, and you had to bathe yourself, and now you're ceremonially unclean until sunset. It was a constant reminder that God is holy and we're unholy. And this woman has been for 12 years, she has never escaped, I believe, the quarantine of being unclean. Oh, the woman, if she went out into public anywhere, she just knows. She knows. She has a secret that nobody else knows. Nobody knows that she's unclean, but everybody she touches, every place she goes, every chair she sits in, she's just made it unclean. And everybody who touches it, she's made unclean. It is this thing that would dog her for 12 years. For 12 years, her conscience could never be freed that I am creating this situation. This is my fault. I bet some of you have had the same thoughts. This is my fault. I have ruined it. I have wrecked it. And she wanted a healing from Jesus. Mark writes about the same situation in the book of Mark. He said, she tried everything. She tried everything. She tried everything. For 12 years, she tried everything. And she only got worse as she tried to get it better. And it wasn't that day that she wanted to steal a healing for Jesus. She just wanted to keep her problem a secret. And so she uses the crowd that day. This is my opportunity. There's Jesus walking through the crowd. This is my opportunity to get to the rabbi, to get my healing, and to remain incognito, to be disguised. I'm going to use the crowd. I don't want anybody to know my secret. And that's what shame does to us. Shame says, you have a secret. Nobody should know your secret. And because you have a secret, you are less than they are. Because you have shame, you're not as good as they are. It's this emotion that erodes the foundational soil of our lives. It makes us want to live our lives in disguise, not really realizing and coming to fulfillment of all that we can be. Because if anybody really knew who you were, or who you are, or what you've done, or maybe what's been done to you, or where your thoughts go. And when we listen to shame long enough, we begin to believe the lie of shame. And so we hide in the crowd, never really able to become all that I think God wants us to be. Because here's what happens. This is exactly where the attack takes place for us. Listen. This is the old lie that started in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve and Satan himself. And the lie is this: if I can get you to question your identity, if I can get you to question your relationship to God, I can do that with shame, you see, because if you have shame, you start to question your identity. If I can get you to question your identity and your value to God, you think you're less than, and God doesn't love you. He loves other people more than He loves you because they probably have nothing to feel ashamed of. But you've got the story. You've got the secret. You're walking around with it for your whole life. And so, because you've got this shame thing going on in your life, you're second class compared to what God thinks of other people. If I can get you to question your identity, it makes you question your value and your worth to God. And so the woman uses the crowd that day to get something from Jesus. Look at verse 44. Coming up behind Jesus. Not from his side, not in front of him. From behind, she hides. She touched the fringe of his robe. And immediately the bleeding stopped. We don't know how she knew that the bleeding stopped, but I would imagine she is so familiar with her malady and her infirmity that she knew in an instant. And this is what I love about this. Get this. She comes up behind Jesus, and she just knows if I touch him, I'm going to get healed. She doesn't want Jesus to know that if I can just touch his clothing, that's all I have to do. He doesn't even know that I touched his clothing. Because if I touch him, if he knows that I touched him, then I know that I've touched him, and I just made the rabbi unclean. I just want to touch his clothes. I don't want him to know that he's been touched by a sinful, unclean, dirty, filthy woman. But the bleeding stopped. And then I kind of love the humor in this story. Remember, Jesus is surrounded by hundreds of people. We don't know how many are there. Look at verse 45. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Peter's like, "Master, how can you, are you crazy? There's hundreds of people here. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" Listen, Jesus could have just kept on a-walking. He could have kept on a-walking. She's got her healing. She could have just walked on the rest of the day. Jesus could have just gone on with the rest of what he could have just headed off to Jairus' house and left the woman whole. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus knows there's more than the physical body that needs healing. There's a spirit that needs healing too. And that's not going to happen unless Jesus says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And it's not that Jesus wasn't aware who touched him. It wasn't that Jesus healed against his will or that he healed against his knowledge. He just wanted some interaction with her. He wants to make her whole. And I just want you guys to know, listen, this is the same Jesus today as it was then. He wants us to be whole people. Whole people. This is what I love. Jesus knows you. Is that scary? He knows what you think. He knows why you do what you do. He knows who you are. He knows where you work. He knows your name. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows your past. He knows your thoughts. He knows things that have been done to you. He knows where you've been touched emotionally and physically. He knows the shame that you have. He knows all these details. And he loves us. Look. If you're a parent today, you get this. You love your kids no matter what. So Peter, like, Master, like, you're crazy. All these people are touched. But Jesus is not going to let this rest. Look at verse 46. Jesus said, look, somebody deliberately touched me. And that was true. Because I felt healing power go out of me. Can you imagine in that moment, who touched me? Master, all these people are touched. No. Somebody deliberately touched me. And Jesus, speaking of at that moment, I would imagine as I see this story in my mind, as I see the crowd in my mind, a hush kind of begins at the inner circle where Jesus is. And since they're quiet, the hush begins to grow to the perimeters of that circle. And now there's a crowd of people around Jesus wanting to know what's going on here. He says, somebody has touched me. And verse 47 says that when the woman realized that she could no longer stay hidden, she wanted to be hidden because I think she felt ashamed for touching the rabbi with her uncleanness. She couldn't stay hidden. Then she began to tremble, and she fell on her knees in front of him. Again, she could have just left. She could have walked on, but Jesus wasn't done with her. Let me ask you this. Here's this woman who finally comes before Jesus and kneels down before him, trembling. I think for 12 years she was sick and tired of feeling sick and tired. I'm tired of living incognito. I'm tired of the shame. I'm tired of hiding. I want to be who I am. And so she comes to Jesus. And I think we all need to be healed in some ways that way. How long do you want to stay hidden because of your shame? And I think it's more than just being physical healed of the bleeding. I think she needed to be healed from the shame, and that's why she came. And here's what I want you to know, that the whole time Jesus is walking through the crowds and the crowd is moving with him, her eyes weren't on the healing that day. Her eyes were on the healer. I've got to get to the healer. No longer satisfied with living in the shadows. Let me ask you this. How bad does it have to get until we say, I need to do something about this shame? Oh, we know how to distract ourselves with the shame. We know how to occupy our minds to not deal with the shame. We can do it through relationships. We can do it through our addictions, through our work, through our hobbies, through our families, through busyness. We can do it all different ways. But then this thing has been hidden inside of us for so long. It needs to be exposed so that we can be whole. And then look what verse 47 says again. The whole crowd. Can you imagine this? This woman who has kept this secret for all these years. Jesus calls her out. It isn't a secret anymore. The whole crowd heard her explain why she touched him and that she had been immediately healed. Well, there it is. The secret. The secret to this woman's inner thoughts, inner feelings, and things in her body. Now, for the first time in 12 years, this could have been a private conversation between her and Jesus, but the crowd hears her explain why she came and touched him as she did. The bleeding of her body had stopped, but I think more than that, I think the bleeding of her soul had stopped. Shame does that. It just bleeds us. It just bleeds us of life. And maybe Jesus made her go public. And I think maybe Jesus made her go public. He could have, like I said, Jesus could have just, Jesus knows. Jesus is all-knowing. So there's Jesus moving through the crowd that day. Jesus is already fully aware that somebody has touched him and that healing has gone out of his body. And she could have walked home. She could have walked home that day being physically healed, but that would have only been half of the healing. She still would have been an incomplete woman because there was something inside of her heart, in her psyche, and in her mind that needed to be dealt with that day. And so Jesus, I think, calls her out, addresses her. She faces the fear of fears to address the whole crowd and tell her what's going on. And maybe Jesus made her go public for the first time in 12 years because you know what? In that moment, she made shame bow down to her instead of bowing down to shame. I'm not going to bow to shame anymore. Jesus took my shame when he hung on the cross. And then I love the tenderness of Jesus. So she explains her story. Like, so awkward to tell my story. Jesus, for 12 years, everything I've touched, I've just turned to dirt. And I felt so unworthy. I felt so ashamed. I felt so unholy, so unclean, so unworthy. And I, for 12 years, have not been able to do anything. I've taken care of, if she had a family, maybe she took care of the family, but I would imagine she's living in quarantine for 12 years. For the first time, she's gone public. And what does Jesus do? She makes her go really public by telling her story. And then the story kind of finishes out this way. Look what he says in verse 48. Daughter, there's a relationship there. I love you. I'm your father. You're my daughter. And I would lay down my life for you, as any dad would for their daughter. He said, your faith has healed you. And then I love what he says finally at the end. And I think this is really where Jesus was doing the biggest healing. Look at the words. Go in peace. She hadn't had that for 12 years. Why did Jesus say go in peace? Except that's what she really needed. She didn't need the physical healing. She needed the emotional healing. She needed the mental and the spiritual healing. Go in peace. Can you imagine how good it must have felt in that moment? There's no indication that this woman felt physical discomfort. I'm certain it was inconvenient. It was inconvenient just logistically. It was inconvenient religiously. But oh, the pain in her mind and her heart and in her spirit for all those years. And when Jesus says, go in peace, I think that's exactly what she wanted. You know, shame and peace don't coexist. And I think that's why Jesus said what he did. And so here's what I love about this story. Here's just an ordinary woman, unnamed. We don't even know her name. She's just an ordinary person, and she puts her eyes on the healer, knowing that if I can get to the healer, the healing will come. I put my eyes on the healer, and she's healed in her body, but she's healed even more so in her mind and in her spirit. She believed that Jesus had the power for her. Let me ask you this. What's preventing you or me from coming to Jesus when we feel the shame, except probably shame itself? And I think that prevents a lot of people from full surrender. They want to have a relationship with God. They want to know that God loves them. But something has happened, at least in their mind, that is so horrible, that is so bad, that is so unforgivable, that is so dirty, that is so unforgivable that Jesus could never see beyond that thing in my life. I don't think Jesus was keeping a record. And so why would we keep a record? The only one that keeps score in our mind is the enemy of our souls. Jesus defeated shame, and he knows our secrets. And so here's what I want you to do this morning. We have some time. I'm just going to challenge you kind of boldly this morning to just, if you need to, I don't know how this lands in your heart, and maybe it's not you that feels the shame. Maybe you know somebody this morning. It's like, oh, Pastor, this is, and you fill in the name. This is them. And you just know that shame is holding you back or holding somebody else back from really realizing their full potential and doing all that they are capable of doing. And the reason I haven't got involved in the ministries of the church is because this happened to me, or I did this, or I do this, and I feel shame. Remember, guilt is regret of doing something wrong. Shame is this feeling that I am something wrong. But you are not something wrong. You're loved by God.